Hey guys, I'm Julian Kasper, and this is a tutorial about how to upload your high poly digital sculptures to Sketchfab as fast as possible, maybe even on a daily basis, and make them look awesome. The reason I wanted to make this tutorial is that SculptJanuary is right around the corner, and for those of you who don't know what SculptJanuary is, it's basically the Inktober of sculpting. 31 sculpts in 31 days with a calendar of fixed topics. And for this year I plan to present my results from every perspective instead of just one image. And for this year Sketchfab is one of the sponsors, which ties everything together very well. Also, I wanted to talk about this topic for quite some time. This tutorial is split up into two parts. In this video I will go over how to prepare and upload your model and the most important settings on Sketchfab with some advice and tips along the way. And in the second part I will show you how to effectively present your models. So without waiting any further, let's get into this. So the first part of this tutorial would be to prepare your high-res sculpts with no UVs and no textures and upload them to Sketchfab. So I recently did this model as a test upload. This is one of the models, one of my speed sculpts from last year's SculptJanuary. And the intention of this model was to use the model and the lighting setup and upload this as fast as possible to Sketchfab with the workflow that I worked out. And I did this in pretty much an hour with a bit of fixing of the lighting setup, of the setup in Sketchfab afterwards, but the bulk of the work was just done within an hour. So let's look at the model. So I have everything in Blender, and I usually also sculpt all of my models, the majority of them in Blender. The workflow that I'm going to show still should work in other software like Maya and Modo and also ZBrush. Especially like Blender and ZBrush also have like Sketchfab add-ons that you can download and install, which makes uploading and especially also preparing the model much easier because you already have all the options that you need in one single panel. So I definitely recommend that. But I'm going to show you how to do it all manually. So don't worry, all of this information should still work with other software. So the first step would usually be to clean up the model. So we have this high resolution sculpt here. It doesn't have a lot of detail, but it still has a high poly count. And if I just turn on the wireframe on this model, you can definitely see it. Like, it is pretty dense, and we don't want to upload 1 million polygons to Sketchfab. That just doesn't work in real time, and especially not in the browser. So one way to do it, usually the quickest and easiest way, let me just duplicate the model and move it to another layer. First thing, apply or freeze all of the transforms, and also check if there are no modifiers or something, or anything with the normals, any issues or something. Just freeze everything down, and then what I usually do is I have this little add-on, so you can also do this manually without the add-on. I just boolean everything together so that we have one single mesh with no penetrating faces on the inside. That just basically saves us a lot on poly count, which is nice. Also, in terms of the scale, you don't really need to worry about that because there are still enough options within the editor of Sketchfab to fix like rotation or scaling issues. And also if the model is like moved too much outside or something, that all doesn't matter, you can still center it. So the main issue that we are going to fix is just the geometry itself. So this is now the boolean mesh, and if we switch to wireframe view, we can probably see, that this is just one singular mesh. All the inside faces are just now gone. It's all booleaned nicely together. So let's go back to solid mode. We have still the issue of poly count, and also at the boolean edges, there are some smoothing issues, so we need to resolve those as well. But first, let's start decimating the mesh, get this to a more manageable poly count. So let's do it. Let's do 15%. We already lost like over 300,000 polys, so this is pretty nice. We should try to get it as low as possible while still keeping all the detail. So this is done now, and if I turn on wireframe again, yeah, this is now much more manageable. But we can already see that that these issues at the border where the boolean happened are now much worse. Everything else, I mean, it lost a bit of the sharpness, but it still has all of the main features intact. So how do we solve these problems? So let's just go to this panel for object data and enable auto smooth, so it will create hard edges automatically for certain angles, and this should solve most of the boolean edges. Also, I should have done this before. No. Yeah, we can see now these issues are resolved. There's still some there, like on the eyebrows, it's still a bit unclean. We can push the poly count a bit more upwards. Something like 200,000 is still pretty good. So let's make this like 0.2, 20%. All right. Well, we can still keep this like this. It's not so bad. But yeah, if we compare this to the original, most of the changes are here at the spikes, but that's because they are just made out of simple cones. But that's alright. So let's just apply that. Yeah, now we have all of that applied. So technically we could just use this mesh and do nothing else, but if there are some little surface details or stuff like that, maybe even from the materials, which we are going to get into as well, some little details that get lost, we can still get those back by just usually, oops. Okay, so how can we get those back? Just by baking a normal map, but we don't have to pay too much attention to the UV map. I would just make a UV map now to demonstrate it. So, okay, so let's just make a smart UV project where it just splits the UV islands at a certain angle. I wouldn't use the 66 degrees standard because it sometimes creates some overlapping UVs, which really bites you in the ass later on. So I would usually just use like 24 to 40 or something like that. I'm just going to use 30 right now and just create some UVs. Yeah, and just these couple of procedures, they take a bit of time, just a couple of minutes, but everything else is usually something that you have much more control over. These first steps are usually the ones that have the most loading screens in them or possible crashes. So be careful about the settings, just don't overdo it. Maybe test it out before if you are trying to do this like on a schedule or something. If you don't have a lot of time, just test it before. That's also something that I did with the setup. Just alright, now we have some UVs, and I mean, these are pretty simple and very dirty, and we don't have to be careful about seams so much with this model because there are some settings that can just hide the seams a bit more later on Sketchfab. So, what now? So we just select all of this. Our decimated mesh as the active model, and then we start baking some normal maps. So I would just, let's switch this to Blender Render actually. Select it to active, and let's try that out. But first we need to add a texture. So let's just add a texture, make it pretty big. We can still downscale it later on, or just bake a new map but with half the resolution. So I just call it bake, no alpha please, and okay. And then bake some, where is it, normals, bake. Alright, and that's how you bake the texture. Skip the little part there. Also, once you use hard edges, there are going to be some normal issues in those areas. If you want to have the best possible result, I recommend making the normal map with a cage mesh in Cycles, XNormal, or any other software that supports baking with cages. I found it hard to find good tutorials on why cage meshes are so important and effective, so I might make a tutorial myself sometime. If you are interested in finding out yourself, look it up on the polycount wikia. They have some very informative articles there. Another part is if you have like multiple materials, like you have the main objects, or with maybe a glowing orb, or some different material settings that you want to apply for different objects, different parts of the model, then you should apply different materials to it before exporting it. I don't have to do that here, just I have one material for everything like you saw in the Sketchfab model. But if you have different materials that you want to set up, just apply them before exporting. You can export it together with the OBJ or FBX. That's no problem. So the next part would be to export it. And that's usually pretty simple. You can just export it as an OBJ, especially if it's just a single object. That is usually the easiest way. Just selection, export just the selection. Also write materials, that's important. And yeah, just this should all still work, and then just export it. You can also export it as an FBX. That's usually the better option if you have multiple objects. If you don't have everything like merged together or like joined, then I recommend to upload it as an FBX. With an FBX you can also upload animations. That's really cool. And yeah, just selected objects. Also, one thing with the size, FBX usually there's a bit of a size difference with different programs. So for Sketchfab I would just do a 1/10 of the size, but usually there's like a size difference between Autodesk programs and Blender, between 1 to 100. So keep that in mind when uploading. But as I said, you can just change the scale settings in Sketchfab either way, so it's not really such a big of the thing. Also, you can install the Sketchfab add-on and upload it that way, but I usually don't do it in Blender because the past times I did it, I didn't really have a lot of control in what is being uploaded, and there's not really a progress bar, so if I do it manually I have more control over it, and that's why I do it that way. But yeah, just use OBJ or FBX and it should work. Also, another thing you can do is export vertex colors. That should usually happen automatically. Or if it's like, I don't know, is it here? Is it like an extra option? But yeah, you can, usually it just uploads vertex colors as well. So if you have some vertex colors, you can later on use that as well in your material setup, which is nice, which I'm also going to show later on. Another tip is for a free account on Sketchfab, the maximum file size for the model itself is usually 50 megabytes. So keep that in mind as well. That's also important why we need to decimate the model, because uploading the original mesh would just it wouldn't work in real time, and you wouldn't be able to upload it because you need to keep it lower than 50 megabytes. Also, uploading multiple OBJs at the same time is possible, but I ran into some problems. Sketchfab usually kept cherry picking one OBJ over the others, and that's the one that was uploaded and all the others were just deleted, which is weird. Maybe they fixed it by the time I'm recording this, but I didn't try it out again. I just kept uploading with FBX after that. So yeah, that's this part, and now we can just move on to Sketchfab. So for uploading this model to Sketchfab, just the basic model, we would just have to click on just register, of course. If you have an account, if you don't have an account, just make one, and then just click on upload and choose file. You can also drag and drop this in. So I would just get my files and put the OBJ that I exported for the model and continue. Also, if you have materials exported as well, you also have to drag those in as well. So keep that in mind. So we can set up like preferences in here, maybe make the model private, which okay, that's usually a pro feature, so you probably can't do that. But yeah, just continue, and then it will start prepping the model. So this might take like a few seconds to a few minutes, depending on the model, and sometimes I think depending on the servers. I'm not really sure about that, but yeah, it already works. Okay, so we get a little preview of the model that we uploaded, and this is already working pretty fine. So yeah, usually the thing that comes right after that is you can go to 3D settings down here, and then you can set up the model and presentation. Let's go over some of the most important settings. The first point here is the general settings for the scene. So yeah, you can fix like rotation issues, maybe advanced rotation, you can do all of that, and also select like the different render engines. Field of view, all of these options are here as well. There's also this option for orbit limitation, where you can fix the orbit to a single point so you can't move around anymore. And maybe also like limit the zoom to a certain point, or the rotation on horizontal and vertical axis, which is sometimes really helpful and really nice. Makes it also easier for the viewer to navigate the model, but it is more restricting, which is why I don't use it always. Sometimes, but not always. Wireframe, it's pretty self-explanatory, but background, we have a couple of different options here. The top option for me is always to use an ambient environment, which basically takes the HDRI that you're using for the lighting and just makes a very blurred ambient version of that. You can also adjust the brightness here, but if you want to have an actually blurred like environment, you can also set the settings here. With a pro account, you can also upload your own HDRIs, which is nice, but you don't really have to. Also, you can use images. There are some pre-made ones from Sketchfab that you can use, or you can also use like a singular color. But ambient environment is usually my favorite. So the next point would be lighting. With the lighting, you are restricted in Sketchfab with 3 lights. You have like the standard direction light. You can also change it to point light, spotlight, and a hemi light, which unfortunately doesn't work in the PBR engine, so just scratch that off the list. So, and also the environment, just the HDRI, you have a pretty good selection of Sketchfab HDRIs. And then you can also choose like orientation and brightness of the HDRI, and also make like shadows for the HDRI, which basically just makes a sun point, like a directional sunlight, and you can adjust the shadow bias and intensity of this light as well. But I usually like, keep it off. So yeah, the best lighting setup for this would usually be a 3-point lighting setup, just with a normal key light, a rim light that, if I go over these settings a bit, you can attach the light to the camera. You can move it around here in the viewport, rotate it, and see the effect here. Attached to the camera, it moves with the camera. It can also cast shadows, which does tax the performance a bit more, so keep that in mind. Don't make like 3 directional lights with that are casting shadows are attached to the camera, and with an HDRI that also casts shadows. That is going to drop the performance quite a bit. But yeah, that's pretty much it for that. And with materials, I mean, I have one material here that I didn't name. These you can pretty much keep in here as they are. And then you can choose, I'm using right now the PBR workflow, so you can choose between metalness and specular workflow. Choose the base color, or you can import textures, which we are definitely going to do for the normal map. But yeah, you can just import textures. And here you have this texture manager, which would list all the textures that you have. You can delete unused textures just to clean up the scene before saving. Or you can just use a singular color and use that. Also like metalness and specular fall off, and you can switch between roughness and glossiness, the intensity on that. You can plug in displacement maps, which we're not going to use. You can plug in a normal map, which we are going to use. So just normal map or bump map. I'm just going to import the texture then, or I could also just drag and drop the texture from my browser, from my file browser, into this field, and it did work. I also baked the textures again with the shader information in there, so this gives some nice little extra detail. And also you can flip the green channel, which is really helpful. Usually when you export it from Blender, you don't have to flip it. But if you're just going to have to try it out. It's just the difference between like normal maps for OpenGL or DirectX. They usually have the green channel flipped, so keep that in mind as well. Also, we have some subsurface scattering and also translucency settings, which are new and really nice. We're going to use them later on as well. For this model, they're not really necessary, so we're going to leave them out. Also, you can import cavity maps and transparency maps. Important point on the transparency maps would be that if you have some textures, you have some extra options here. Just for the texture, you have to choose in these options for transparency if it takes the alpha channel or just the black and white texture for the transparency. And yeah, definitely use that. But for the transparency, like blending is usually the best one. Dithert has the best rendering effects also for the lighting, but it is very noisy. So use that sparingly, I guess. And we can plug in an emission map, which we're going to use later on as well. And of course, double-sided and single-sided. So if you have if you don't see any back faces, you can just put single-sided in here and it will save some performance. And yeah, that's pretty much all the material settings. So let's move on to post-processing. So we have some options here as well, like some extra ambient occlusion that we can put in here, or some grain effect. We can also make this animated. And we have some depth of field, We can set here the foreground and background blur, and also it usually takes like the center of the screen as the point where it's not blurry, but you can also just click at a point and it will focus to that point at the model. And then you also have some sharpness that you can apply, or some chromatic aberration, which I pretty much never use. Vignette, which I use pretty much every time. And bloom, which is really nice. But be careful that that doesn't just blow out of proportion. You can do some tone mapping. You can also switch to filmic, which is really helpful, really nice. There's some exposure, brightness, contrast setting, the usual stuff. And some color balancing for highlights, midtone, and shadows. Just tweaking some tones if you must. And then at the bottom is just some extra anti-aliasing that you can disable if you want to save some performance. Also, one thing that I forgot is this little thing here. You can, when you have everything ready, everything set up, everything looks good, then just center it to the point that you want people to view it. And also make sure that the rotation point is right. So just double click on the point that you want people to rotate around. Just double click on there, it zooms in and it rotates around that spot. And then align it and then click Save View. This will basically just make a little thumbnail for the model and also fix the rotation and orientation for every viewer at the startup of the model to that exact position. And if you're done, just save settings, and that's pretty much it. Those are all the basic settings. Or there are actually some more. I'll keep finding new things that I forgot to talk about. Okay, we have like the basic PBR settings, but there's another thing which is the madcap view for people who want to view just the model by itself. And this is just like a extra visualization of the model, which has its own little options. You basically can choose from a couple of madcaps. I think you can even upload your own with a free account. So just select one that you like the most. You can also tint like the color of the model of the madcap. Just do this. And it usually just, the madcap kills all the texture information and color information except for like displacement, normal or bump maps, and transparency. It's just a very much more simpler view of the model. And then just save settings. Oh no. Also make sure that it's back to your standard view, standard renderer before you save the settings. Save again. We have the view saved. Okay, exit. And now we can look at it in the Sketchfab view. This is how other people would see it then. And you can dial through the different modes with the 1, 2, 5 keys. With 2, you can go through different textures. We can see, okay, there's just a normal map. Every other information is just one color. With 3, you can go to the madcap, and madcap with and without normal, wireframe, and vertex normals. And then with 4, you can check on the UVs, which are really messy. And with 5, you can enable and disable an extra wireframe on top. You can also see these in the scene inspector over here and just see all the different options over here. Just click through them. And that's it. This is pretty much it. Everything should be pretty simple once you know where everything is. And here is where I end part 1. If you want to see how I did the rest of the setup for the 3 models in the background, then continue to the next video. I hope you liked this first part, and I'll see you in the next one.